I keep thinking that there's always this discussion of how much everything's going to go back to normal next year, and that this is almost like a psychological tell that we're engaged in a form of wishful thinking, or that we deep down know that things are not going to go back to normal. And that what COVID-19, it's obviously a stress and a crisis for the system, but it also revealed that there were many ways in which the system wasn't quite working. And I think the status quo ante simply doesn't make sense. People do not want to go back to 2019. So 2019 was a year of there were all these sort of old economy institutions that had been on autopilot for 20 years. You think of 2020 as the first year of the 21st century, and the 20th century has gone on 20 years longer than it should have. Student debt was a problem in 2000. It was $300 billion. By 2019, it was $1.7 trillion. It was growing exponentially. It made no sense. 2020 is the year we jumped the shark, and you're spending $50,000 a year for Zoom calls instead of going to college. And everybody can see this is totally ridiculous. And I don't know if you go back to the pretty dysfunctional status quo ante. And I think what's true of the dysfunctional zombie colleges system is true of maybe all sorts of institutions. Since the mid-1990s, people had talked about telecommuting as sort of, the next big innovation in transportation. Maybe what railroads were for the 19th century and highways were for the 20th, telecommuting could be for the 21st. And for whatever reason, it didn't quite work, and maybe the technology wasn't quite there. Maybe it was just some sort of collective action problem where we didn't have the will to do it. But in 2020, we've gone into the 21st century. Perhaps we should have done it 20 years ago, but we've done it. And I think these super dysfunctional megacities like New York and San Francisco are not simply going to come back. They're going to have to actually solve their problems, and they can't just count on 20th century network effects to bail them out, because in the 21st century, the network effects will not be driven as much by physical geography, but can be more virtual. And there's a sort of radical reconfiguration of what that a city will mean in the years ahead. And so I think there are quite a number of things that will live music concerts come back? I think so. I think people would like to go back to those. But I think there are a lot of 20th century institutions that I would be very, very skeptical of here. And it's going to be a very radical transformation in the years ahead if these changes last. I think directionally it is going to stay that way. The tech companies in Silicon Valley have been perhaps the most vigorous in pushing this. And if you have an internet company, one of the things you believe is that you're capable of using the internet yourself. And so it is very on brand for Silicon Valley to get remote work to work. And if you had a tech company that says we can't use the internet and remote work doesn't actually work for us, that actually at this point sounds like the wrong thing. So I think they may not completely shift, but I think the big tech companies are going to make a pretty big shift. It will be pretty long lasting. Their employees have signed 1-year leases, all over the country to live elsewhere. And I think it will just get rolled over from here. And then we can debate how much of the rest of the economy this will be true of. But if you sort of think of Silicon Valley tech as being, where the future is going, that's probably going to last. It's hard to say what's going to happen with assets. It seems to me we have this, super weird experiment going on with interest rates, where the interest rates keep going lower and lower, and is that going to be sustainable or not? If they can keep the interest rates as low as they are, maybe a lot of asset prices can be stabilized. If it finally breaks, that's going to be probably a challenge, across the board. But yeah, I know probably the one asset that I most strongly believe in. As an investor, you often want to find things that are so stupid that other investors are embarrassed to invest in them. And so, for example, the FANG stocks were an instance of a stupid asset. It was the really big tech stocks. It was just Jim Cramer came up with the FANG acronym on Mad Money in 2014. If you just followed his advice, you would have made 8 times your money in the last 6 years. We've done better than any venture capitalist. It was too stupid in a way. And so my candidate for the investment that is so big and so stupid that professional money managers are embarrassed to do it because it suggests they're not doing enough work is to just buy Bitcoin. The sense I always get is that people often don't really, they just use these things as buzzwords, and everybody in the room uses them as buzzwords, and nobody even knows what they mean. And there was an Obama administration document, a friend of mine pointed me out the other day, where if you used every instance of the word AI and you replaced it with computer, it still made just as much sense. And so, it's sort of like we should at least acknowledge that this is sort of roughly where the policymakers are, where they don't understand the difference between the word AI and computer. If you can do a search and replace in a document, and it still means as much or as little as before, we somehow don't understand this.
Is this because they're not digital natives, or because they're too far removed from where technology is being created, or why do you think that is?
It's somehow there's a discourse about technology where everybody in the room knows that they don't know what they're talking about, and they can just use the same buzzwords in a way that makes no sense. So I think if we were to make AI less abstract, is it the next generation of computing? Is it the last generation of computing? Is it, superhuman intelligence? Is it just sort of big data, machine learning applied in certain kinds of narrow context? So I think you have to always sort of concretize it very, very specifically. I would say certainly one dimension of it that seems to me to be quite important to policymakers is, should we be thinking of this as a weapon, that it's going to be used in conjunction with cyber, in conjunction with other weapon systems, and that this is sort of what is really at stake in the AI race between the US and China. And even framing it that way pushes you into very uncomfortable space for Silicon Valley. So I think we have to just avoid hiding behind the abstractions. Or it's like the Huawei 5G thing is again it's a discussion about very particular things about 5G. How does it roll out? Do we need it? What are the actual alternatives? And hiding behind just the 5G buzzword just obfuscates way more than it illuminates. It's been quite hard to figure out a way to create a real win-win dynamic between the two societies. And certainly there are parts of our society that have benefited and that have done well. I think it's quite a bit less than it was 13, 14 years ago. So, maybe there were some very unhealthy things about the China relationship in the mid-2000s, but there was a broad cross-section of U.S. business leaders that believed it would be good for their businesses, that China was a natural expansion market. And, if you say what sectors of the U.S. economy still believe in China, I would say it is a subset of Wall Street. So it's sort of asset gatherers on Wall Street because they get money from China. It is Hollywood, and it is the universities. And that is a relatively narrow pro-China constituency. It's mostly a Democratic Party one, but it's probably too narrow even for the Democratic Party. And so I think even in the Biden administration, it's unclear whether those industry groupings will be enough to overcome, the very real challenges from China in, military arms race, in, hollowing out manufacturing in the U.S., in IP theft. So there's sort of all these other places where the relationship is very challenged, and I think it will be quite hard to get it to a healthy place from here.
Do you think a Biden administration needs to really pick its battles with China? I mean, we're in competition with them to stay, obviously, and a lot of people in Washington who are centrists think that it's got to stay a competition as opposed to something worse than a competition.
My sense is probably the technology part of it is an important part where we have to stay competitive, and that involves questions about semiconductors to 5G to AI, and I worry that that's an area that DC is generally uncomfortable about discussing, and that people would prefer talking about having an open playing field for trade in soybeans or something like that. I'd like there to be more focus on these hard tech and IP questions, even though